Thank you so much for joining us today on our latest series of recruiting during COVID. We're really excited about today's guest. Montserrat Miller from Arnold, Golden and Gregory is one of the industry's leading background check compliance attorneys and employment labor attorneys overall. She's going to be sharing with us today some insights that she has on background check compliance during COVID. So Montserrat, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for hosting.
Terrific. Well, we've got 3 questions for you, and we're going to jump right into it. Our first question is, how is COVID impacting background check compliance?
So that's a great question because it's impacting it operationally, but legally, from a compliance perspective, I wouldn't say that COVID has directly impacted what employers must do with respect to their pre-employment background checks. So operationally, it may be that background screening companies have to address issues with respect to court closures and delays in processing. But from a compliance perspective for an employer, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FCRA, and state law still applies. And while I've seen some government exceptions in certain areas that are applicable under COVID, for instance, and I raise this only because Form I-9 compliance is typically sometimes bundled with the background check process itself. So it's all part of the onboarding process. And so you've seen some compliance in that area with respect to remote workforce and remote verification for completion of the Form I-9 Section 2. You've seen flexibility by the Department of Homeland Security with respect to the use of expired driver's licenses for Section 2 completion, but I wouldn't say, or I'm not aware of any related flexibility by the government when it comes to a background check. So if you're an employer, Fair Credit Reporting Act still applies.
That's great news for employers. So it's business as usual. Now, of course, I'm going to throw a curveball at you based on the questions I sent you, so I apologize in advance. You hit the nail on the head. It's what I do to you. You hit the nail on the head in terms of court closures with COVID, right? And that's a moving target for both background check agencies and the impact on employers. So let's say as a background check agency on behalf of an employer, I'm doing a background check report. There are 4 counties. 3 return within their typical expected time frame, but 1 may be in New Jersey, and it may be a couple weeks delayed for very good reason. Any advice on how employers should think about that?
When I look at that, I think about an employer looking at their disclosure and authorization. And sort of the first thing that comes to mind to me is, does your disclosure and authorization, the consent form that captures, that advises a job applicant about the background check that is going to be conducted and captures their consent, does it have evergreen consent language? And so if it doesn't, and evergreen consent language is obviously very restricted and in very simple terms, because we know that the disclosure and authorization is the subject of a lot of litigation. So you don't want to include extraneous information in that form, and you just want to make sure it's tightly written. But you should have a sentence or 2 that talk about this background check your authorization for this background check is being given for a check now and in the future that may apply for employment purposes, which under the FCRA is employment retention, promotion, or reassignment. So it's important to have language as an employer in your disclosure and authorization that says, I, job applicant, give my consent now and in the future for a check to be done, so that if you're in a situation where there is a court closure or a delay in that record coming back, and it may be that your offer is conditional on the check being done, but perhaps you're affording some exceptions, which I'm going to get to that in a second, and you want to do a check later, then you just want to make sure that that disclosure and consent that the applicant has given allows you to do that in the future. And while we're on this topic, I just want to say quickly about if you have these policies that make certain exceptions because of unavailability of information, and it's either, an unavailability to me can include a court closure,
Mhm.
a prior employer isn't available or isn't readily available, or it could include a school being closed. And so as a background screening provider, you can't access that information. All of those could be in the future a situation where an employer may want to go back and do that check at a later point in time. And so if you have those policies, just make sure as an employer that you are consistently applying them so you don't potentially discriminate against somebody on a basis of a protected class like race. And one thing real quick, David, let me just legal disclaimer, I forgot to mention this at the beginning. Anything I say is just for educational purposes. It is not intended as legal advice. Okay, back to you.
This is what our conversations are like all the time. So this is I'm very used to this. So thank you. Well, that's really practical insight with the very important disclaimer you gave. Also kind of thinking about as a background check program owner, there's a lot of things you're trying to manage during COVID, but any other like two or three practical tips for background check program owners during COVID?
I think one of the biggest ones is the ability as an employer to adapt and change and to be nimble in this environment. Things are going to happen. And, at the beginning of the global pandemic, when it came to the background screening industry and employers and background screening companies, and even lawyers, I think it's fair to say that we were all surprised that we were entering into a 100-year global pandemic, just like the Spanish flu. I mean, who knew that that would happen in our lifetimes?
Yep.
So I think initially there was that element of surprise and not knowing what was happening and how it could impact your operations and the information that you find in the reports themselves. Now we're prepared. We know that in the fall and winter, the pandemic is going to surge, cases are going to surge. Should be prepared for court closures, for employers not providing information as quickly, for schools limited hours so you can't get the information, perhaps turnaround times aren't as quick. And so I think being able to adapt and change is important. And for employers, I think it's also, they're going to see employees in the workforce that wouldn't typically be in the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might get, from high skill to workers
Yep.
that you wouldn't normally have seen in the past. And so you think being nimble and adapting to change is important. So that would be one.
Okay. That's a good one.
Two is transparency is key. And I think that's a two-way street between you as the provider and the employer, and whether it's a staffing company or an employer, everybody understanding and being transparent about availability of data and the fact that there may be delays with some of the data. So if you had seen a turnaround time with a report of 24 hours, maybe it's going to be 48 hours just because of unavailability or closures or restrictions, limitations on time. So transparency is key. And I think the third one for me, I have two more. So I have 3 plus 1, 4. That was a lawyer doing math for you.
Of course you do. This is great.
Automation. I think automation with a remote workforce is so important. And I know that, for Scout Logic, with you providing full optimized platforms, is just going to be so important with a remote workforce. And for employers to also consider some challenges their job applicants may have. They may not readily have access to internet or a computer, but I just think automation in this industry is so important, and really moving away from paper-based forms and diving into automation and leveraging technology, particularly with a remote workforce. And I think that is going to be a change that continues moving forward. People will go back into offices, but that work from home feature isn't going to go away. And with that being said, data security. Employers, it's so important. Those reports, the entire onboarding process contains personal data and sensitive information. So you just what you need to get a background check. You're typically dealing with name, social security, driver's license. You get a report. It includes sensitive information of the individual's history, potentially data security is key. So if you're an employer, if you're a recruiter, and you're dealing in an automated environment and you see something that you think, I don't know how secure that is when that employee or that job applicant sends me their social security number. By all means, flag that to
Yep.
your IT team, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know.
That is just such great advice. Even beyond COVID, right? Particularly the last 2 points, we will sometimes still run into companies that are with other background check vendors that are looking at ScoutLogic who still do everything on paper. And when you ask, well, where do you keep all this? And it's like, well, it's in so and so's filing cabinet drawer that's unlocked, right? And there's they pull the drawer out and there's papers everywhere. Like, that is a host of issues for all the reasons you articulated. And I think you're right. I think with the work from home environment, COVID's really forced companies to really engage that automation in a more secure electronic environment. And to me, that's a small benefit that's come out of the recruiting process for some companies, for sure. So great insight. So with that said, with all this rich insight you're giving us, we want to look into Montserrat's crystal ball on 2021. And I guess this doesn't have to be even COVID related, but just in general, kind of where do you think that background check compliance legislative agenda is moving? Any kind of hot litigation topics you see going into 2021 that employers should be aware of, Montserrat?
Right. So as far as Montserrat's crystal ball, there are a lot of things I'm hoping for. And one of them is that we move beyond, I'm ready for 2020 to be done with. However, so a few things. And on the legislative side, so whether it's in Washington, D.C., up on Capitol Hill in the Congress, or at the state level, but I think particularly with the national election, if the Democrats do in fact take the Senate, and we have Democrats who control the Senate and the House of Representatives, I think you will definitely see some privacy-related legislation coming out, and some of that could in fact impact background checks, because the Fair Credit Reporting Act falls into that privacy bucket. And so there could be some changes, particularly around the use of credit reports, perhaps, and employers' ability to use credit reports. I know it's not,
Sure.
Those aren't as frequently used as criminal history, which is the holy grail, but that could be one change. I think at the state level, employers should absolutely continue to monitor fair chance hiring and ban the box laws and ordinances, and make sure that if they are in a state or a jurisdiction that requires ban the box, which is not asking on the job application about criminal history, taking a little bit further, only considering criminal history after a conditional offer of employment and individualized assessments.
Yep.
Those are growing, have been growing, and I think they'll continue to grow, because that's part of a larger issue related to reentry of ex-offenders. So that's something that I think won't change, but the election will tell us what will happen up on Capitol Hill.
Yep.
As far as as far as litigation,
Yep.
I don't expect there to be a downward trend with FCRA related. No, I don't. I just think everyone's at a lull right now, because plaintiff's bar is impacted by court closures as well. It doesn't mean they can't file, but I think there's a little bit of a lull right now. So I believe that 2021 will not necessarily see a decrease in FCRA related litigation. And so employers really need to focus on that closure and authorization, on following the adverse action process. And, David, as we get to the end of the year, I'm sure you say this to your clients too, the beginning of a new year is a great time to revisit your policies, your procedures, and that disclosure and authorization form is a fluid, living, breathing document.
Yep.
And it changes, litigation or the court cases inform the document itself. So happy to work with anybody to review their forms, but I would certainly be reviewing those forms, particularly the disclosure and authorization. And I think the last trend that I see, which is really interesting, frightening, terrifying all at once, is...
That's quite a lead-in, by the way.
Yeah. Is guns in the workplace. I just think that employers should be looking at their policies and procedures around that. And, this is something that I think people have been talking about for a few months now, between the pandemic, uh, protest, the recession, just the discord that we have in this country at this point in time, and the disconnect, sadly, that we have at this point in time. And, I mean, I'm not just saying this in a vacuum. I mean, the FBI is reporting that background checks for gun ownership are up. If I'm not mistaken, there are more guns than people in the United States. And while this is not intended at all as a political
Yeah,
statement, it's just merely an observation that I see trending, and employers might want to consider looking at their gun policies and procedures, because it could go into the background check process, and whether you're screening applicants out because they are a gun owner, which is not permissible in certain states, and different states and local jurisdictions have their own rules, might be something that employers want to look at, because background checks are done in part to ensure a safe workplace, and
absolutely.
that goes to it. So
And kind of the first part of your answer, Montserrat, around, policies, authorizations, procedures. I always tell people that's like good hygiene, right?
mhm,
Everyone should go see their dental hygienist twice a year. Everybody should take a twice a year look at all three of those things. And I always tell people, if you're doing that, your litigation risk is probably reduced dramatically. The
right,
second issue you hit on, I think that is going to be a hot topic for many employers next year in terms of their policies, if and how it should impact their own background check programs, as we can kind of continue to navigate these troubled waters. Again, politics aside, but simply
right,
from a policy and workplace safety perspective, I think that's a great insight and a great view into your crystal ball.
right.
Awesome. Montserrat, I know how busy you are, so thank you so much for taking some time out of your schedule to share your insights with us. And I hope the rest of the year goes quickly and you stay safe.
All right. Thank you. And thanks for hosting, David.
All
Bye,
right,
everyone.
take care. Cheers.